Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Steve Johnson. I'm a solution architect with Amazon Web Services. I specialize in mobile and IoT services. And I'm really psyched to have my friend Val from Twitter here today. So we're going to split up the presentation. The first half, I'm going to dive deep into Cognito and how the plumbing behind Cognito works. And Val has an awesome demonstration, code heavy, of how Twitter authentication works with Cognito, and then the back end with AWS. So this is a 400 level talk. So I'm assuming you're generally familiar with identity schemes, that you're familiar with things like OAuth 2.0, and you have some background in that. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to dive deep into Cognito identity. We're going to learn a little bit about Cognito sync features, especially the two new ones, Cognito Streams and Cognito sync events. And as mentioned, we're going to have a really cool Twitter demonstration at the end of the talk. So Amazon Cognito is actually split up into two separate APIs. There's the Cognito Identity API, which handles things like authentication, identity federation, and anonymous account tracking. The sync half, I think we're having trouble with the mic. Pardon me. The Cognito sync API handles things like syncing events and data with the cloud, syncing data across devices, and also the two features, Cognito sync triggers and Cognito Streams. Throughout the conference this week, just about every question I fielded about Cognito was about identity. So today's presentation is going to be heavy on the identity side. If you guys are really interested in the sync side of Cognito, I'll be available after the talk and spend as much time as you want talking about sync. Okay, let's talk about Cognito identity. Cognito was built on top of AWS's identity services to address the needs of mobile developers. And our mobile customers were telling us they needed to be able to track customers no matter how they logged in, no matter what devices they logged in from, and even if they didn't log in at all, which was kind of an interesting challenge. The second thing they asked for is to provide appropriate credentials for AWS services. So access any AWS service, any level of permission, and make a distinction between authenticated and unauthenticated users. Okay. So this is what AWS identity looks like before Cognito, or without Cognito, because it still exists. Okay? So if we take a look at this diagram, you start with your mobile client, which will authenticate against some identity provider. And that identity provider could be a web identity like Twitter or Google, Facebook. Could be a SAML assertion from an enterprise identity provider, or a custom identity provider that supports OpenID Connect. Once authenticated, you will get an identity token in your mobile device. And we're going to take that identity token and send it up to the Security Token Service, or STS. What STS does is it takes a look at your security token, and it takes a look at the role you want to assume, and checks your identity against the trust relationship of that role. Now, if you guys are familiar with IAM, you're probably familiar with roles, and you know that every role has two policies. There's a trust policy, which dictates who can assume the role, and there's an access policy, which gives you your permissions on AWS resources. So assuming that the trust relationship check is passed, STS will create temporary AWS security credentials that go down to your mobile device. Okay, and that's the basic flow for getting temporary AWS tokens from STS. And of course, once you have those credentials, you can access whatever the access policy allows you to do. In this case, we're just pushing data to S3. So keeping in mind this is our starting point, STS, we now need to build a service that addresses the needs of those mobile developers. So the first thing we did is create something called an identity pool. Now, an identity pool is a logical boundary around a set of identities. Okay? You can have 60 pools per account. Usually you associate an identity pool with a mobile app, but there's nothing wrong with associating many apps with a single identity pool. And there's an unlimited number of identities inside that pool. Associated with your identity pool are two roles. There's an authenticated role and an unauthenticated role. They're just normal IAM roles. You can associate any of your current roles with the identity pool. And the permissions on those roles are exactly the same. So by default, if you have an identity in Cognito, it will be able to access mobile analytics, and it will be able to perform Cognito sync with your mobile data. The only real difference between the default values of these roles is one mandates that the trust policy checks for an authenticated identity, the other one does not. Okay, so what we have on the screen here is an example of using the mobile SDK. This is the last time I'm going to show you the SDK during the presentation, mostly because this SDK, like good SDKs, abstract a lot of the details about what's going on. So if I was coding Android, like this example here, I would create something called a credentials provider, and then I would use that credentials provider to get an ID, and then get credentials for that ID. And that is really simple. Unfortunately, there's a lot going on under the covers that advanced developers can actually take advantage of if you use the Cognito APIs instead of the SDK. I should also mention that the mobile SDK is available for Android, iOS, Unity, and Xamarin, and it's also available for JavaScript. So if you're using an environment that doesn't support one of the mobile SDK, this talk should be interesting because I sort of show you how to use it on non-supported languages. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is create an identity pool. Identity pools by themselves are not very exciting. You give it a name and a region, and it will create a pool for you. The next thing you have to do is associate roles. And using the command line there, set identity pool roles, you just give it an authenticated role and an unauthenticated role if you created your identity pool allowing unauthenticated roles. So unauthenticated roles are optional. You can choose to create an environment where you require authentication. That's fine. Okay. Now that we have an identity pool set up, I'm going to show you the command line to generate an unauthenticated identity. So this is AWS command line, as I'm sure you guys are familiar. So I'm calling Cognito identity with the command get ID, and I'm telling it which identity pool I want to create the new identity in. As soon as I find my cursor. Okay, so what I've just done is create an unauthenticated identity in that identity pool. Interesting about unauthenticated identities is I can create these all day long. In fact, if you have a mobile app, it's usually a good idea to go ahead and make this call as soon as you have your user installs your app and you start a game or a session or whatever. You can take this identity ID and you should actually cache it on the device. The reason you cache it on the device is that it's very hard to recover that identity from the mobile device itself, right? Since it's unauthenticated, there's no way to ask the server for that identity back. Obviously, on the back end, using API and console, you'll have a list of all your identities inside the identity pool. But rule of thumb is if you're working with unauthenticated identities, make sure you cache those. Okay. Following the flow here, we've created an unauthenticated identity. Now I want to get an identity token back from Cognito. Okay? So once again, I'm going to call the Cognito identity API, and I'm going to get open ID token. This time, I'm just going to give it an identity ID. I don't have to give it the identity pool because Cognito knows what pool it's in. So I'll just paste the identity ID there. Wait for the internet, and we have a token. So this is a Cognito identity token. It's in the Open ID Connect format, which we'll talk about in a second. But now the clock's ticking because this is a temporary token. And if I want to get AWS credentials, I have to use this token before it expires. And the expiration is not very long. So this time I'm going to call STS instead of Cognito, because that's the service we're calling. And I'm calling assume web identity assume role with web identity. So I'm going to give it the ARN of a role I want to assume. In our case, it's going to be the unauthenticated role associated with the pool. I'm going to give it a role session name, which can be anything, so I'll just name it after me. And then I have a web identity token. So I'm going to pull the token in. Token 6, I talked too long. Okay, so the token's invalid, which shows you what happens if you hang on to the token too long. So I've created the identity pool. I've created an anonymous or an unauthenticated ID, which gives you the ID back. We got an Open ID Connect token by passing in the ID. And then we got the credentials. So before I talk about the credentials, let's talk about that Open ID Connect token that you get back from Cognito. Okay? Open ID Connect is actually an identity layer that's built on top of OAuth 2.0. And the way it works is actually pretty simple. They added a new feature to OAuth 2.0 where you can request an identity token from the service in a specific format. And that format is called JWT, or a Java Web Token. So what I'm looking at here is a Java Web Token. On the left is the token I got back from Cognito. And it's not encrypted, it's just base64 encoded. So I put it into this website. It's a cool website called jwt.io. And it shows you how the token is broken up into 3 pieces. There's a header that tells you how the token is signed. There's a body that contains key value pairs describing the identity. And then, of course, there's the signature at the bottom. Cognito tokens are exactly the same as any other OpenID Connect tokens. You can see the key values in the payload there. Sub stands for subject, and that will contain your Cognito identity ID. AUD is audience, and that will contain the ID for your identity pool. AMR will contain a list of services that have authenticated this identity. In this case, it was unauthenticated, so that's just what it says. And then there's an issuer, which is Cognito, an expiration date, and then the time it was created. So this is the command I wrote with the expired token. Basically, you tell STS which role you want to assume, give it a session name and the token itself. So STS cracks open that OpenID Connect token takes a look at those key value pairs in the body of the token and compares it against the trust policy for the role you're trying to assume. And if that role, if you pass the trust check, you will actually get the credentials. And the credentials, temporary credentials from STS, are slightly different than the long-term credentials you generate for your users. In addition to the access key ID and the secret access key, you get something called a session token and an expiration. And the session token has to be submitted with any secured API calls when you're using temporary credentials. Okay, so this is what we've accomplished so far. Basically, we've taken the basic flow and we've established Cognito as an identity provider, but the identity provider doesn't do a lot of interesting things. We can get anonymous users, and we can get tokens for those users. And because they're anonymous, we can renew those tokens as much as we want and keep getting credentials from STS as they expire. Even if this is all that Cognito did, it's still pretty interesting because those identities all have sync data associated with them, and you'll be able to sync data in the cloud with your devices. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So where things get really interesting is when we talk about authenticated identities and the way Cognito handles those and federates identities across devices and across accounts. So let's take a look at the same basic API calls we just used. And you'll notice for authenticated identities, we actually add another parameter called logins. So if I was to call getID with an identity pool, and now I also submitted an identity token from, let's say, Twitter, right? I did Twitter authentication, I get a token back. I will actually create, instead of an unauthenticated user, I'll create an authenticated user. The second one we called getOpenID token is really interesting because that is the call that actually does federation. That's the call that takes a look at the inputs and its own database and figures out which identities are actually logically the same person. So getOpenID token takes the identity ID, and it takes logins, which are your identity tokens from other identity providers. And it'll give you back the token, if there's no security exceptions, like we saw. And it'll potentially give you back a different identity than you passed in. Okay? So if Cognito actually federates identities, it will combine them on the back end and give you potentially a new ID. So we're gonna walk through a couple use cases for that right now about when that occurs. Okay, so the first one is called promotion. Okay, this is an interesting use case because as a mobile developer, making a user log in is kind of a speed bump in user experience. If somebody just downloaded an app, sometimes the last thing they want to do is log in before they play a game or use your app for whatever it's used for. So your customers may potentially be using an unauthenticated ID for a pretty long time before they trust the app enough to actually put in some credentials. So the use case we're showing here is calling getOpenID token with a blue unauthenticated identity. But this time we're passing in a Twitter web identity token. Okay, when Cognito sees that, it says, okay, it checks the token against Twitter's OAuth server, says this is a good token, and promotes, that's a little magic thing, promotes this unauthenticated identity to an authenticated identity. You'll actually get back the same identity ID in this case, but now it's authenticated. And from now on, whenever you want to get a token from Cognito, you have to authenticate that request with a valid identity token. Okay, the next use case is just a simple lookup. Right, you have an authenticated identity, you pass in a valid token, you'll get back the ID you expect with a valid token. So this is probably the least interesting, but it is important to note that just because you have an authenticated identity, you must also have a valid token every time you request a Cognito token. Okay, this is the federation use case. And let's say you have a customer that's using your app on their phone, and they've authenticated on their phone with Twitter, for example. And they've been using an authenticated identity for weeks and weeks, and maybe they go home and load your app on a tablet, right? So the tablet doesn't know anything about the phone. The app on the tablet doesn't know anything about the app on the phone yet. You're probably working with an unauthenticated ID. But if that customer logs in with the same Twitter account that they were using on the phone, Cognito will recognize that Twitter token and actually merge the anonymous identity with the authenticated identity. And when I say merge, it's not just a question of housekeeping and merging events. If you have built up Cognito sync data for each of those identities, that sync data will be merged as well. Okay, in the last case, not authorized. So some developers believe if you have an authenticated identity and I pass it a different but valid identity token, let's say Facebook here, like Cognito knows that this identity is associated with this Twitter login. It doesn't know anything about that Facebook credential. So even though I'm submitting a valid authenticated ID with a valid web token, I'm going to get a security exception because Cognito doesn't know if the identity behind that Facebook account is the same as the identity behind that Twitter account. If you did want to combine or federate different web identity provider tokens under the same account, I would have to submit both the Facebook token and the known good Twitter token. In that case, Cognito will look at it and merge those identities together. From that point forward, that same identity could log in with either Facebook or Twitter. Okay, that's the most confusing part of the presentation. As you can guess, there's a lot of rules and different conditions for get open ID token. The chart that describes them is a bit of an eye chart. I included them in the deck, so if you get the deck after the conference, it'll actually include that table for you. So this is what we have now. We've now upgraded our Cognito identity provider to an authenticated identity provider. And we can support different logins. We can support Amazon, Twitter, Facebook, Google, Twitter digits. Did you guys name it that way on purpose? It's like a tongue twister, Twitter digits. And OpenID Connect. And OpenID Connect might be familiar with some of you IAM users, because that's the format we use for custom identity providers in IAM. Okay, so if we crack open a Cognito token for an authenticated ID, you'll notice the AMR field is different this time. And instead of saying just unauthenticated, it'll say both authenticated and the name of the identity provider that validated the token. Okay? And so what's kind of neat about this is all the information in the body of this token is usable by IAM when you're writing your trust policies for your roles and your access policies for your roles. So here's an example of using that information in a trust policy. By default, the trust policy for the authenticated role in Cognito just does a string-like comparison on the AMR field, and if it contains authenticated, it'll pass, right? So it doesn't matter who authenticated it as long as it's authenticated. You could be more specific if you wanted to and say, I only want to do a hit on Twitter, or maybe Twitter and Facebook, or Twitter and Amazon. It's up to you. Moral of the story here is any of those fields that are in the body of that token is fair game for doing comparisons in your trust. Okay, an example for the access policy is you can use those same keys in the token as policy variables. So in this case, what we're showing is a rule that allows a user to access just their own S3 bucket, assuming, of course, their S3 bucket is named after their Cognito identity ID. But same idea here. Use the $ and braces for your policy variables. You can go ahead and use those Cognito identity fields for that. One question I get a lot is whether or not you're restricted to 2 roles in Cognito, right? Because by default, it generates an auth and an unauth. The nice thing about going outside the SDK and using the command line tools and some of the APIs is you can play all sorts of havoc on these roles and policies if you really want to. For example, you can modify the auth and unauth roles with different trust policies for just about anything. In addition to changing the basic trust policies and access policies, you can associate multiple roles with a Cognito identity pool. So one of the coolest things about identity is it's literally built on top of existing AWS and IAM security. So if you're familiar with things like roles and policies and identities, you can actually have a lot of fun with Cognito and do things that the SDK and the console won't let you do. Okay, one last thing I want to show you is, on the subject of identity, is developer identities. A lot of mobile developers like using Facebook, Twitter, Amazon for their customers to log in. You know, they get authenticated identities that way. They have their own sync data. But a lot of customers who aren't necessarily mobile developers want to use Cognito for their own identity purposes, right? And chances are, if that's the use case, they're going to have their own database filled with usernames and passwords. So how do you actually make your user database trusted by Cognito? And the good news is it's one server-side API call. And it's generously named Get Open ID Token for Developer Identity, because we like being explicit. And we don't care about keystrokes. So I should also mention every Cognito call I've shown you so far, get ID, get open ID token, and even assume role with web identity, the STS call, all those are open calls. There's no permissions required to call them, which is nice because you don't have any permissions at that point. That's good. This one, however, for obvious reasons, you do actually need to explicitly give permission to make this call from whatever entity is calling this. Otherwise, there would be chaos in the streets. People would be generating AWS credentials willy-nilly all over the place. So what does that look like? Looks pretty much the same, actually, except the main difference is you're going to authenticate against your own server, against the developer login. You're going to make that secure request call to Cognito, and it'll hand you back a token. So I am going to quickly jump over to my machine. And I've set up a really quick little demo on developer authentication here. So I'm starting here in the Cognito console. I have an identity pool. And if I go under authentication providers, I see the web providers, Amazon, Facebook, Google. And if I go to custom, I've entered a reverse DNS name that represents my developer server. Okay, it can be anything. Just remember what it is. And in this case, it's just com developer name API. Okay, so now the pool is ready to accept token requests from my server. And I'm going to jump over to Lambda real quick. And This is actually going to get called by API Gateway, but it could be called from anything. I'm using the JavaScript SDK for Cognito. I'm slightly lying here by setting up a Dynamo object, even though I'm not going to use Dynamo for this. But it takes a username and a password as an input. This commented out piece is where you would call your authentication server, LDAP server, Unix password file, doesn't matter, right? However you authenticate your users, put it in here. And assuming you've passed authentication, this is where you make the call. The parameters are pretty simple. It's the identity pool, the logins, and in this case, it's com developer name API, the same string we put in the identity pool on the Cognito console. And then I pass in a unique identifier for that user. And that unique identifier can be anything. It can be a GUID or however you identify a user in your login structure. Okay. I can set the token duration. In this case, it's an hour. And I make the call. So I'll hop over to API Gateway. I've created a simple REST method, resource called login with a post method. And I am going to put the username and password in the body of the request and send it to the Lambda function, which will in turn call Cognito. And that's good. I got a 200 back, and that is your Cognito token. That's your OpenID token. So once you get this token in your code, send it to STS, and you'll get your credentials. Okay, and that's just another slide showing the use of API Gateway, in my case, and Lambda to do the lifting on that. So to close out the identity piece, here's a couple tips. Make sure you always cache your unauthenticated identity IDs, like we said before. That's something the SDK does for you automatically. It'll actually save it on your mobile device's storage. Trap security errors, so you know when to re-authenticate. Like we saw in the first part of the demo, if you hold your tokens for too long, they will generate a security exception, and you need to renew your credentials. Make sure to customize default access policies for auth and unauth roles. That's sort of a given. But even the default roles are still useful because your mobile apps can call mobile analytics and or Cognito Sync. And lastly, if you do use developer identities, do not use the code I just showed you, because this is security. Make sure you lock down the login workflow. And it's by its nature already secure because you have to explicitly give an entity permission to make that call. But obviously, good security practices apply. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about Amazon Cognito Sync. That's our friend, the identity pool on the left. And for every identity inside that pool, whether it's authenticated or unauthenticated, we allocate 20 megabytes of data in the cloud for that user. Synchronizing 20 megabytes of data at a time seems a little excessive. So we actually broke it down into something called a data set. And a data set can contain up to 1 megabyte of information. Inside those data sets is just key value pair information. You just have a key and a value, and you can have up to 1 megabyte of that. And frankly, for a mobile application, that's a lot of data. So because the data set is sort of like the unit of resolution for synchronization, here's what you should probably do, depending on your use case. One way to save power is to do a sync on connect. The SDK has a special call called sync on connect, which is aware of whether or not the device is connected to a network, and will only sync when it's connected to the network. Because sync happens at the data set level, you can organize your data into different data sets depending on how frequently they need to be synced. Obviously, the less data you sync, the faster it'll occur. If you require immediate updates, there's another feature called Cognito Push Sync. This takes advantage of the SNS mobile push feature of AWS, which uses the platform's, I guess you would say, native mobile push mechanisms for this. So for Google, it would be like Google Cloud Messaging. Apple uses, for Apple and iOS, it would use their service under the covers. One other thing that's interesting about Cognito Sync that I don't see used a lot, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Kindle readers, the e-ink readers. Anybody use those? Fantastic, I love those things. If you've ever read a Kindle book on more than one device, sometimes you'll be confronted with a dialogue that says, hey, you're on page 38 here, but we've tracked you reading up to page 200, which is annoying because in my house it means somebody else was reading my book and probably synced to the wrong page. So the nice thing is you can have that same behavior in your mobile apps because when you get the call back from the sync operation, it will tell you if there was a conflict between the data you pushed up and the data that was already on the server. So it sort of does a primitive versioning, and the callback methods will give you control over what actually gets stored in the database. So it's a good practice to customize those callback methods if you want that type of behavior. If you do nothing and use the default callback methods, the last data in wins. That's the way it's set up. Okay. So let's talk about one of the new features in Cognito this year. It's called Cognito Sync Events. It's pretty simple, actually. Every time there's a sync event with a cloud, you can basically have it call a Lambda function to handle that sync operation. So why would you want to do that? Basically, Lambda will intercept the data at that point, and anything you do with that data will actually be the data that gets synced into the cloud. So let's say somebody pushes in a whole mess of data, and you want to validate some of that data. You want to make sure it wasn't tampered with. Somebody hasn't decompiled your app and done something clever with it, right? You can also do read-only attributes. You can actually inject attributes on the server that the client can't change, right? That's pretty useful. And there's actually a blog post that was written on how to use this function to help prevent exploits and cheating in mobile games. So you actually have some options at that point. In addition to managing the data, changing the data before it gets stored, it's a Lambda function, so you have access to the rest of AWS. You can send it to Dynamo, you can send it to Redshift, you can do whatever you want with that data. Okay, talked about that. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about before Val comes on the stage is Cognito Streams. This is another hook you can take advantage of in your identity pool. Basically taking all the streaming data from these sync operations and send it into Kinesis, which is fantastic. So if you have a very large customer base, you can be streaming all of your sync data into Kinesis without actually loading up the Kinesis SDK on your devices. And from there, naturally, you can read that data off of Kinesis, put it in S3, store it, data warehouse it, whatever you feel like doing. Okay, so that ends my portion of the presentation. Very excited to have Val from Twitter here today. So thanks, Val.
Hey, everybody. Give me just 1 second to switch computers. So it's 6 p.m. I'm sure everyone here saw a lot of PowerPoint today, so I only have 4 slides, and then we'll jump into code. Sound good? I'm sure everyone knows Twitter, the app, Twitter, the website. Some of you might know our API. We have a product called Fabric. Fabric is a set of tools for mobile developers. There are 4 SDKs inside. We call them kits. So there's one for stability, one for revenue, social, Twitter, and the last one is identity. So the identity piece is called Digits. Digits allows you to authenticate users based on their phone number. The most basic diagram that I could come up with, the Digits SDK allows you to drop a UI into your app, mobile or web. The user is prompted for their phone number. We get the phone number. We issue a 6-digit, hence the name, text message. The user confirms the PIN. And you, as a developer, you get an ID and a token back. So the ID is stable. In other words, the user can change the phone number, but the ID will remain the same. So you can use it as a primary key in your database and make sure that that identity remains the same. And the token is used to verify the credentials. So Cognito uses that to make sure that this is the correct user and it's authenticated and everything's great. So digits in one slide or less. It's on iOS, Android, JavaScript. We're live in over 200 countries and 28 languages. So that means if your phone is set to, let's say, French, you're going to get the French SMS. We have a portal, digits.com, where end users can log in, enable two-factor auth, and change their phone numbers. And we do voice verifications fallback. So that's live in US, India, and Brazil. So if you don't get the SMS, you can press a button, and you'll get a verbal confirmation of the code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to integrate digits, Cognito Identity, Cognito Sync, Lambda, and Dynamo in less than 10 minutes. So this is a vanilla iOS app in Swift. If you haven't seen Swift before, don't panic. It's actually pretty straightforward. I already have some boilerplate Cognito code there. So that's my pool ID. I have digits installed as well. One thing I want to show you is we provide a separate app to manage the SDKs. So it's a separate app for iOS, and it lives in IntelliJ, Android Studio, or Eclipse on the Android side of things. So this is used to manage the SDKs, get updates. We provide some getting started snippets. And if you're using the Crashlytics kit, which is one of the kits in Fabric, it would automatically upload the DSIMs for you. So DSIMs are used to deobfuscate code and get actual stack traces and correct crashes, actually see where the crashes lived. Anyhow, so digits is already installed, so I just want to go here. I'm going to use the snippet for signing in with a phone number. So just go to Swift. So do some copy-paste driven development. Import digits kit, copy this. Right, so I'm actually not going to show anything fancy, and I'll just print the user ID provided by digits for myself and print the phone number. So great. So this is the UI. You can customize it. You can change the colors. You can change the fonts. You can add your logo. There's no API as of today. So what I'm going to do is put in my phone number, and I just realized this is being recorded, and I've made a huge mistake. Future viewers, do not call me. So I got the SMS. That's great. 78, 26, 54. And here we have what we're looking for. So this line of strings, line of digits is my ID, and this is my phone number. So yeah, so that's great. What I want to do now is link the digits identity to a Cognito identity. So that's a two-step process. I need to put in my digits API credentials in the pool settings and pass my tokens up to Cognito. So you can get it from the dashboard. I'm just going to get it from here from the code. So go here, edit my pool. Auth providers, Twitter digits, put this thing here, put this thing here, save changes. So that part is done. Now we're just going to go back here and do self, credentials provider, logins, and then go, so www.digits.com, session. Then I need the token, which is this one. Just need to do this. And also token secret. So what this is doing is I'm basically passing the token and the token secret that I got from Digits to Cognito. Cognito will internally call our servers, make sure that these things are valid, and create a Cognito identity based on that. This will happen at some point in the future. Amazon doesn't recommend doing this, but I will just refresh and continue with block. So I'm just going to refresh the identity manually. And I'm just going to print the ID of the Cognito identity. Okay, so let's see if this runs. So I sacrificed the Fire phone before this, so it should work. Bum, 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 bum. And here we have my now Cognito identity ID. So if I go back to the website and I go in the identity browser, it should tell me that there's one linked login, in this case, Digits. So we have Digits connected to Cognito ID. So now you can imagine in your app, you have a Digits login, you have a Twitter login, you have a Facebook login. To get all those three linked to one Cognito identity, as Steve said, you just need to pass a valid token plus the new one alongside. So you'll pass the existing Digits token with the Twitter token, and those two identities will be merged into one. So that's cool, but let's see if we can enrich the identity with some more data. So what we can do is create a data set. Let's call it user data. And add to the data set the phone number returned by Digits. So is it set? Yeah, it's set. So let's do session phone number, and we call it phone number. And then let's do self sync client synchronize. Actually, no, it would be data set synchronize. Continue with the block. So this will just sync the data set that you created in code with the cloud. Return nil. And let's say if task error is nil, we'll just print success. Cool. So let's do this. I'm already logged in, so I don't need to put in my phone number. And we have success here. So if we go back to the pool, we now have a data set called user data, which contains the phone number. Cool. So now we have Digits, Cognito identity, and then Cognito sync. Now, something that Digits does not provide is the country code. So it'd be great if we can somehow enrich that data set with some more data. And you can do this using a sync trigger. So if I go to my Cognito pool settings, I can select here a Lambda function, save changes. I already wrote the function. I don't want to write JavaScript live on stage. So I'm just going to show you. I'm using a third-party node module by some company from Mountain View, who shall remain unnamed. And what basically is happening here is that whenever that synchronized call is made, this function will run when the event type is sync trigger, so that's what's happening. And the event object, the payload, will contain the data set that I just created. And what I'm doing here is I'm parsing the number from the data set, I'm getting the country, and I'm creating a new entry into the data set with the country code. So that's great, but it would be nice if I could somehow know that I'm doing something in the cloud with the data set from the app. So you can do it. I'm going to cheat a little bit and do this. So you can add a notification. So when the synchronized call is being made, you can listen to when the sync starts, when the sync ends, when data is changed locally, when data is changed remotely. So in this case, I'm just going to go and do N2. I'm just going to print the data set. So let's run this. Use my phone number. And now you can see that I have nowhere in my code I'm putting the country code, but it's here. And if I go to the data set, identity browser, user data, and now I have my country code. So we got digits, we got Cognito identity based on the digits identity. We have Cognito sync, which creates a data set. We're adding stuff on it on the fly through Lambda. And I just want to go back to the Lambda function that I wrote and show you this little piece of code where in the back end I created a Dynamo instance. So if I want to, let's say, aggregate all the users that are in the US, can't do it with dataset, you can do it with Dynamo. I'm creating just a new item. So my Dynamo is a Cognito ID as my global hash. I got my phone number and my country code as global secondary indices. So I just create an item and push it to the database. So if I go back to the Dynamo instance, scan, and now we have the same thing in Dynamo. So to recap, we've added digits to the app. We got the token from digits, created a Cognito identity based on that. We used Cognito sync to create a data set, enrich the data set using Lambda, and then finally push everything to Dynamo. To conclude, digits is, like all the other kits in Fabric, is completely free. Like I said, it's on iOS, Android, and JavaScript, and you can get it on fabric.io or digits.com if you're just interested in digits. And with that, thank you.